Welcome to the Climate Report. This is Hart Hagen, and I am thrilled to be here with Judith Schwartz. Judith, how are you doing today?
Really well, thanks.
Great. So Judith is the author of 3 books, which I can highly recommend. They're excellent. They are Cows Save the Planet, Water in Plain Sight, and Reindeer Chronicles. And so we're going to talk first about the work of Allan Savory. So Judith and I are both in a Facebook group called Soil for Climate, and Judith's first book was Cows Save the Planet. So we're going to talk about Allan Savory, but Judith, first, let's talk about cows. I mean, cows are supposed to be the devil, cows are supposed to be bad, all those cow farts and the methane and all that. So how did you come upon the notion that cows can actually be good for the planet?
Yeah, so it's a great question just to get right in there because the title just like puts it out. So basically the way that all this evolved, and so it's a book about soil, and I had no intention of writing a book about soil, but as a journalist, sometimes your topics find you. And what happened to me is I was at a conference. It was actually a conference about economics, which is what I was writing about at the time. And then someone made a statement that would not let me go. And that statement was that over time, more CO2 has gone into the atmosphere from the soil compared to the burning of fossil fuels. And that hit me over the head because I thought, wait a second, I thought it was all about fossil fuels, and I thought I was pretty well educated on all these things. And so I wanted to find out about it and learned that, sure enough, about how the carbon cycle worked, about how agricultural practices and the way that animals had been managed or unmanaged had led to a scenario where carbon that wants to be in the soil was in fact being released. So this was extremely compelling to me, especially when I learned that by bringing carbon into the soil, you're not just, like it's not just this equation of what's up there and what's down there, but also carbon in the soil holds water, which means more resilience to floods, droughts, and wildfires, that our food can only be as nutritious as the soil in which it is grown, and that biodiversity starts in the soil. So I got very, very excited about this. Now, at that time, and we're talking a decade ago.
Like, why didn't anybody tell me this? Why didn't anybody tell you
Exactly.
that? Right.
That's it. But so as I was exploring this and asking that question, well, why isn't this common knowledge? The only people that were talking about soil as a climate solution or something, as a way into addressing climate change and other ecological challenges, were people who practiced holistic management, holistic planned grazing, which is the use of livestock as a vehicle for large-scale restoration. So that's what got me into the cow scene.
So
Now,
how did you start to meet the people that are involved with cows sequestering carbon and all the other benefits? How did that fold out?
well, first it was reading about it, and then it was just reaching out to these people to see who was talking about it and write to them. And actually, there is another piece there that as a journalist, at that moment, I was in a very fortunate time when I had a couple of editors, 2 editors at 2 publications that were willing to trust my instincts.
What were those
And
publications?
so one was time.com
Mhm.
and Time Magazine. I have to almost laugh when I remember that actually I was writing about alternative currencies in Time Magazine and why buying local helps the economy, which at the time seemed kind of radical. So time.com, and then a publication called Miller McCune, which became Pacific Standard, which is now defunct. They paid decently, which is a huge thing because freelance writing rates have not gone up at all
Right.
since I started as a journalist at the age of 23 in the early 1980s.
Hmm.
So, you want to be respected for your work in addition to wanting to be able to make a living. So it was wonderful to have that. So I was on this kind of whirlwind tour of what started out a kind of tour of new economics, which reflected the questions that I had been asking myself and wanting to pursue.
And
And
new
then
economics.
soil.
I love the subtitle of new economics. Economics as if people mattered, you know?
Yeah, as if people and the planet matter.
Mhm.
Yeah. Whereas what we have right now sometimes is, instead of economics serving people and the planet, it's configured so that people and the planet are supposed to serve this entity called the economy,
Mhm.
which is a human-made construct. So we can refigure this.
Right. So you've been all over the world, including like Chihuahua, Mexico, Australia, Los Angeles, North Dakota, Spain. And at some point in your travels, you had the opportunity to meet Allan Savory in Africa, in Zimbabwe, and his operation called the Africa Center for Holistic Management. So Allan Savory is a legend in this particular niche field. And how did you get an opportunity to meet him? And what happened? What did you see when you got to Africa?
So I'd met him a few times before I actually was able to go to Zimbabwe. And by the way, Zimbabwe is a really long way away. So it's like not something that you just,
Yeah,
can.
sure.
Yeah. So I'd met him a few times at conferences, in New York City when he was speaking, in Albuquerque, just where he was then living. So I had gotten to know him at that point, and it was clear to me that if I'm going to keep writing about holistic management, I needed to get down there. So I was fortunate enough to get a journalism grant from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, and to get a few assignments to go to help, you know, s- support the whole operation, the trip, and make it really meaningful in a journalistic way. So I just feel so lucky. And I can tell you, I was at the Africa Center for 8 days, and there were many times that I had to pinch myself and say, what dumb luck brought me here? Because it was extraordinary. So yeah, I really am happy to share what I saw of Alan and his, the way his mind works, that one might not just get from, say, the TED Talk or an article here or there.
Absolutely. So the thing that strikes me about Allan Savory, I've listened to his audiobook, Holistic Management. He reads part of it. Actor reads part of it, but yeah, he's a real innovator. I mean, he's a real, like, the mind of Allan Savory is unique in this realm. He's truly pioneered a whole school of thought, because it's one thing to know how cattle can be a benefit in France, where Voisin wrote, but then how do you translate that to dry environments and the unpredictability? He really had to think deeply and draw upon his deep experience. So you got to visit Allan Savory. What did you see there, and what did you learn, and who are some of the interesting people that you met?
Well, I'll say that one thing that is just so striking about Alan is the power of his observation. So Alan was a tracker, or I guess still is a tracker, and has trained trackers, and the incredible, like, granularity of
Mm.
his ability to look at a piece of land, at a tree, at a bunch of grass, and be able to
Hmm.
get information from, again, and this is a core of tracking, of your deep experience of what different phenomena look like, such as having been nibbled, or what animals might have left tracks, and what has been what tracks may be kind of smeared away by other animals, and how the state of moisture in the environment. But that was really observing. His keen capacity to observe was really a revelation, because I could just have been someone, if you had just kind of dropped me in that landscape, I wouldn't have known what to look for. I wouldn't have seen
Hmm.
anything that might have, I- it all would have been lost on me. And
Right.
it's that observation that over time that led him to some really extraordinary insights.
Right. Well, one thing about Allan Savory, he kind of gives academia a hard way to go because they're so siloed and everything has to be peer reviewed. Whereas, if science ought to be about observation, you know. So,
Yeah.
what are some of the main conclusions that Savory has drawn? Um, how does Savory connect to cows saving the planet, and how does that work?
Yeah, so this brings up one thing that is one of his insights, which is the brittleness
Mhm.
scale.
Mhm.
So what I find so interesting is how that kind of calls to attention the way landscapes function. So basically, the brittleness scale, it describes a particular landscape in terms of not how much rain a landscape gets, which is how we tend to look at whether a place is dry or has moisture, has drought problems, etc., but the distribution of moisture over time. So I'm here in Vermont, which is a very non-brittle environment because there is moisture distributed fairly evenly through the cycle of a year. And where in Zimbabwe, where he made his, derived his insights, it is a brittle environment because all of the rain will come in a very limited part of the year. And where the cows fit into this, I think is really interesting. That, all right, so in a brittle environment, when you have a long dry period and a short rainy season, that presents nature with a challenge. And the challenge is, how do you maintain moisture in the soil? Okay, because that you need it to keep plants growing, to
Right.
keep the microbes
Right.
functioning, and all of this. How do you maintain moisture in the soil from the end of one rainy season to the beginning of the next? And the solution that nature came up with was through the behavior and digestive systems of ruminant animals. And that's what Allan observed.
Right. So one of his major observations was that, that it's not that is that there, in the beginning, before there was so much human disturbance, there were a whole lot of ruminants, cattle, deer, antelopes. He tells one story about there was this certain type of antelope that the antelope herds were so dense that you better unhook your ox before they got there because this dense antelope herd would just bowl over. And he started looking at the records in in Zimbabwe and discovered that there was there were a whole lot, contrary to the notion that there are too many animals on the land. There used to be a whole lot of animals on the land. So that's an observation that he made. And
Yeah. Yeah, and he made that observation in part because he saw that the condition of the land had deteriorated because he was always in the bush, throughout his childhood. And, that was his passion, was to be in the wild with animals. So he saw that from his childhood to when he started working for the National Park Service in his mid-20s, that the condition of the land had deteriorated. And he kept asking why. And the assumption was that there were too many animals. But what he saw is that when they closed off areas to let it rest, the land deteriorated yet further.
Who would have thought? And we're still assuming in North America and elsewhere that the land needs to rest, but actually the land needs animals, and they need to be they need to not be overgrazed or undergrazed, but there's a certain strategy to it. But anyway, we need more cattle on the land. Since cattle are something we have control over, they kind of ecologically, they have to replace the megafauna that used to exist, used to roam freely, used to pass over a certain area in a kind of a rhythmic way, so that the grasslands co-evolved with those ruminants.
Absolutely. So we need more animals in the right places, managed in a proper way.
Right.
So there are different landscapes that have different communities that help regenerate keep those landscapes thriving. And in a place like Vermont, where I live, it's in a non-brittle environment. You don't need the animals to keep the system going in the same way. So our microbes are happy and our plants are growing. In other words, it can look okay without us doing anything. Now, of course, like there are nuances, but in brittle environments, once you disrupt that pattern and keep animals out, or which would be undergrazing, or have animals overgraze, then the land really deteriorates and you get desertification.
Right. Tell me about the particular area that Allan Savory manages in Africa. What have been some of the changes over time that have occurred as a result of his management?
Yeah, wow. Just, as you say that, I'm in my mind, I'm coming up with the photographs and the films. So more grasses. Also, and this is something that Allan pointed out when we were there, a diversity of grasses. And he pointed out to us, I say us, my husband, Tony, was with me on this trip. And that was extra special because Tony is from South Africa and himself wanted to be a game ranger when he grew up. So, anyway, they had fabulous conversations too. So I'll just give you an example. So Allan picked up a seed, and showed us that it's a seed that is the kind of spiral. And so that's a seed that thrives on bare ground. And that's what he would call fire dependent, because wildfires would open up and leave bare soil. So that when you create conditions of bare soil, which is what you get with desertification and not managing the land in an optimal way, you are essentially managing to promote fire dependent plants, which means you are creating the conditions for more fire. So anyway, that's a kind of nuance. So what he said is that as the land gets healthier, you move from a landscape dominated by fire dependent grasses to animal dependent grasses, because there are grasses that depend on animals to promote their germination. So that's a nuance, but definitely greater biodiversity. So one thing that I remembered that made me really happy is that when I visited Dimbengombe, the Africa Center, we just taking little walks, which were with guides, just, on the periphery of the Africa Center, that we saw a number of animals, but we also saw sable antelope, and they were nice, healthy herds with young. And we know that those animals only do well in a healthy landscape with a diversity of grasses. So seeing them was a clue to me that they were making the land healthy.
So what do animals do? Cattle, deer, antelopes, what do they do to the land that is good for it?
Yeah, so it's this whole kind of choreography. So, well, their waste helps cycle nutrients and moisture, and their movement presses down seeds so that you get greater biodiversity. Their trampling also creates craters where moisture can pool. And another thing that's really important is that when they trample, and that's like, it's almost a stampede, when they move quickly
Mhm.
together as a herd, they're pressing down plant material so that it can be broken down by the microbes, by all the microorganisms. And that doesn't sound very sexy or glamorous, but oftentimes, in terms of thinking of how landscapes function, we focus on the growth and we don't focus on decay.
Mm,
But decay is hugely
right,
important,
right.
because if you don't, so all plants senesce, they get old, they're in the dry season, they're not growing. Nature wants to break down those
Mhm.
plants. And it can be done, actually, this is something that Allan says, it can be done biologically, which is through the digestive processes of plant-eating animals, or chemically by fire. So nature's going to do it one way, or also fungi,
Mm,
um, which you get fungi when you have sufficient moisture in the environment. Nature is going to, which the animals can help to create. When I was in Zimbabwe, I remember people in villages that are working with the Africa Center saying how many more mushrooms they get now, which they
mhm,
loved,
mhm,
because that's another food source, and it was also a
mhm.
sign of health. But the point is that nature is going to break down that plant material one way or another. And you can tilt it away from fire, because while fire is, of course, part of ecosystems, you don't want too much fire
Mm,
for like multiple reasons. You
right,
certainly don't want out of control fire.
right. So so there's a river that it flows longer than it used to. And the elephants used to have to come back to a particular watering hole, but now the elephants are not confined to that watering hole because the river is longer. So tell me about that river and what you can see there.
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me, because I have to go back to this trip. Yeah, so that's the Dimbengombe River. And when they started improving the land, it never occurred to them that they would be able to create a scenario, regenerate the land so that the river would perpetually flow and through the year, because usually it just flowed during the rainy season, because all of the local people remembered it as stopping during the rainy season. So yeah, after, let's see, I'm trying to think like what year that started, maybe like 15 years, between 15 and 20 years after they began uh, applying holistic management to the landscape, it it started to move to go further up into the water catchment, and also flow through the year. So yeah, so it didn't stop. And what that meant was that different species that like continual moisture began to show up. So they would start getting sedges and reeds and fish eagles and different kind of amphibians. And so the whole community of species that dwelled there and thrived there completely expanded and opened up.
So tell me about the effect, the positive effects of this management on the people who live there.
Yeah, that was another huge revelation. So the Africa Center has been working with a number of villages, and we went to a few of them, and everybody wanted to tell their story because they are so proud of what they've been able to do. So one place that was particularly dramatic is Sianyanga, and this it took a while to get up there. It's in near the Wangi uh, National Park, which is also really interesting because they could compare the landscape with that, with what's going on in the national park. So one person that gave us a tour of that is Precious Fury, who actually grew up in those lands, in the Wangi communal lands. So she actually was a trainer that worked with this community, and she said that when she began working, the land was so horrible. She just really didn't think anything would be possible. She was very discouraged, but she kept going and worked with the community. So this is a community that had been totally dependent on international food aid. And they were telling stories about that, about what that was like. Like you hear from a distance about villages on food aid. You might read in the news that, they government, international agencies are providing food for this place or that place. But it's it meant that they had to wait online. It meant that they couldn't really depend on it. It meant that their children could not go to school because they were not the adults worried that the children were not strong enough to be able to make it walking to the school and back. It was and it meant a lack of dignity and sense of assuredness of and that they were, yeah, it really drained on their sense of self-respect. So they learned to use the livestock as a to improve the conditions of the land, and these are very poor people. So each animal that they had was really important to them and was a source of their wealth and their sense of their own personal stature. So they didn't have enough animals for each person to do much management. So they pooled all the animals into one herd so that the animals would move from crop field to crop field, so that each person's field had optimal animal impact.
So it sounds like Allan Savory's methods and recommendations have a very positive impact on the landscape, on the wildlife, on the people. What do you think, what would be the bigger picture, like, recommendations? If you could wave a magic wand and make something happen, what would you like to see happen in this regard?
Well, I think in this regard, to know that it's possible to restore degraded grassland ecosystems. And I would invite people to open up their thinking, because I know often it gets to be about a personality, like, I like him, I don't like him. No, like we don't need to go there. Let's just ask how these landscapes work. Just be curious and see what's possible, see what animal impact can do. I mean, just with so many species, because I've been writing about these kinds of things for a long time. I mean, my latest book is called The Reindeer Chronicles, and I'm working on some journalism about wild donkeys in Australia, that people's assumptions
Mhm.
of how animals impact
Mhm.
the land, how animals interact with the land, it's often counterintuitive. So I would just invite people to be curious and to see how we can work with animals, become partners with animals who want to create the conditions in which they thrive as
Mhm.
well. So there are all these creatures out there working to heal landscapes so that they can be healthy and thrive as well. So I don't know if that makes any sense,
Right.
but that's what.
So Judith, it sounds like Allan Savory has great ideas that are good for the landscape, for the environment, for the climate. Why have his ideas had such a hard way to go?
Wow. I think because it is counterintuitive, because it seems to make logical sense that the more animals there are, the more they would use up the landscape. So I think that it's because we are prone to linear thinking in which that logic would prevail. So I think that's it. And because there's just been generations of range science and assumptions, and that this is a sense of, and also just how people have been doing things, that it's really hard to turn that ship. So I would say that is the main reason. And then any other things, people may not like his style, or whatever. I think that may be a justification for the disinclination to change our way of thinking.
So one last question. Is there anything else I should have asked you about Allan Savory or cows or ecological restoration?
Well, when you get into ecological restoration, I wrote a whole book about it, so let's save that. But
Okay.
yeah, I gave you a little glimpse of Alan from my perspective, so that all feels good. That feels
Well,
right.
well, Judith, this has been a great conversation about Allan Savory and holistic management and the value that animals have, that animals can be a very positive impact on our landscapes, contrary to most of what we hear. And thank you so much for joining me.
Sure, my pleasure.